The art critic at the gallery trashed my favorite painting for 20 minutes. I painted it. I was standing in the corner of the Meridian Gallery, nursing a glass of cheap white wine and trying to blend into the crowd at my own opening reception. My latest series, Urban Solitude, hung on the pristine white walls around me. 5 years of work finally seeing the light after countless rejections. The gallery owner, Patricia Langford, had taken a chance on an unknown artist, and I was grateful enough to let her handle all the publicity while I stayed anonymous in the background. I'd worn my most generic outfit, black jeans, black blazer, minimal makeup, hoping to observe genuine reactions to my work without the filter of knowing they were talking to the artist. Most people moved through the space politely, wine glasses in hand, making the sort of pleasant but meaningless comments you hear at every art opening. That was fine by me. I just wanted to see if my paintings could speak for themselves without my name attached to them. The centerpiece of the exhibition was a large canvas I'd titled Waiting for the 6:15, a oil painting of a woman sitting alone in a subway station at rush hour. I'd painted it after spending weeks riding public transit, sketching commuters who looked lost in their own thoughts, despite being surrounded by hundreds of other people. The woman in the painting had appeared one evening in December, elegant in a worn coat, checking her phone while crowds streamed past her like water around a stone. I'd captured that moment of urban isolation, the way city life could make you feel invisible, even in plain sight. The painting had taken me 8 months to complete, working and reworking the light, the shadows, the expression on her face until I felt I'd gotten it exactly right. It represented everything I was trying to say about modern loneliness and connection, and seeing it properly lit in a professional gallery space made my chest tight with something between pride and terror. A woman with perfectly styled gray hair and expensive jewelry positioned herself directly in front of Waiting for the 6:15, studying it with the intense focus of someone who clearly knew art. She was probably in her 60s, wearing a cream-colored suit that screamed money and taste, with a young man in his 20s hovering beside her with a notebook and pen. The setup immediately identified her as someone important in the art world, probably a critic or collector, with the young man as her assistant or intern. I moved closer, pretending to examine a smaller painting while straining to hear their conversation. The woman's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to having her opinions taken seriously, and I found myself holding my breath as she began to speak. This could be the review that launched my career or destroyed it before it even started, and she had no idea the artist was standing 6 feet away from her. The woman, whose nameplate I could now see read, Victoria Whitfield, began what could only be described as a systematic demolition of my painting. Her voice was crisp and confident as she pointed to different areas of the canvas, explaining to her assistant why each element demonstrated the artist's fundamental misunderstanding of composition, color theory, and emotional resonance. She described the subway setting as derivative urban realism that's been done to death, calling the lighting amateurish chiaroscuro that failed to create genuine atmosphere. According to Victoria, the woman's expression was melodramatic rather than genuinely melancholic, and the overall composition lacked the sophistication needed to elevate the mundane subject matter into something meaningful. She spoke with such certainty, such absolute conviction in her assessment, that several other gallery visitors began to gather around her, nodding along with her critique as if she were delivering a masterclass in art appreciation. Victoria's assistant scribbled notes frantically while she continued her analysis, pointing out what she called technical deficiencies in my brushwork and conceptual poverty in my artistic vision. She compared my painting unfavorably to Edward Hopper's work, saying that where Hopper created genuine pathos and psychological depth, this piece offered only surface-level sentimentality disguised as profundity. She noted that the artist had clearly studied the masters but failed to internalize their lessons, resulting in work that copied the appearance of serious art without understanding its substance. The gathering crowd murmured appreciatively at her insights, and I watched several people nod and move away from my painting as if Victoria had opened their eyes to its obvious flaws. A few even took photos of her nameplate, presumably wanting to follow up on her reviews later. The woman was systematically destroying my reputation in real time, and nobody had any reason to doubt her expertise. The critique continued as Victoria moved on to discuss the broader implications of what she saw as failed contemporary art. She used my painting as evidence of a larger trend toward emotional manipulation rather than genuine artistic expression, claiming that modern artists relied on easy subject matter like urban loneliness because they lacked the skill to tackle more complex themes. According to her, paintings like mine represented the democratization of art education leading to technical competence without artistic vision. She suggested that galleries like Meridian were doing a disservice to the art world by showing work that hadn't been properly vetted by established institutions and critics. Her assistant asked whether she thought emerging artists could overcome these limitations, and Victoria's response made my stomach clench. She said most young artists today were more interested in being artists than in creating art, focusing on identity and personal expression rather than mastering their craft and contributing to the broader cultural conversation. I felt my face burning as Victoria's audience grew larger and more engaged with her impromptu lecture. She had positioned herself as the expert educator, using my work as a cautionary example of everything wrong with contemporary painting. Several people were now taking notes themselves, and I heard someone whisper that Victoria Whitfield's reviews could make or break an artist's career. The authority in her voice, the specificity of her criticisms, the way she connected my single painting to broader art world trends, it all combined to create a devastating portrait of an artist who simply didn't understand their own medium. I wanted to walk away, to escape to the bathroom and process what I was hearing, but I found myself frozen in place, morbidly fascinated by the complete confidence with which she was dismantling work I'd poured my heart into. Every technical criticism, every aesthetic judgment, every dismissive comment felt like a physical blow, but I couldn't stop listening. Patricia Langford, the gallery owner, appeared at my elbow with a concerned expression, having noticed the crowd gathered around my centerpiece painting. She whispered that Victoria Whitfield was one of the most influential critics in the city, that her review in tomorrow's paper could significantly impact sales and my future career prospects. Patricia had clearly been watching the impromptu critique session with growing alarm, understanding that Victoria's public dismantling of my work could undo months of careful planning and positioning. She asked if I wanted her to intervene, to perhaps steer the conversation in a different direction, or introduce some positive voices to balance Victoria's assessment. But I found myself shaking my head, needing to hear exactly what this expert thought of my work without any interference or damage control. If my painting couldn't stand on its own merits, if it was really as flawed as Victoria suggested, then I needed to know that truth, no matter how much it hurt to hear. Victoria's assistant asked her about the artist's background, wondering if knowing more about their training or influences might change her assessment of the work. Victoria laughed, a sharp sound that carried across the gallery, and said that good art should speak for itself regardless of the artist's biography or intentions. She explained that she never researched artists before reviewing their work because she wanted to encounter the paintings with fresh eyes, allowing the work alone to succeed or fail on its own merits. This approach, she claimed, was more honest and objective than the current trend toward contextualizing everything within the artist's personal story or social identity. According to Victoria, Waiting for the 6:15 failed not because of who painted it or why, but because it simply wasn't good enough to warrant serious attention from the art world. The painting revealed an artist who had ambition, but lacked the technical skill and conceptual sophistication necessary to execute their vision successfully. Her assessment was purely aesthetic, she insisted, untainted by external factors or personal sympathy. The irony wasn't lost on me that Victoria was praising her own objectivity while standing in front of a painting she was completely misreading. Everything she criticized, the lighting, the composition, the emotional tone, had been carefully planned and executed exactly as I'd intended. The derivative subway setting was deliberate, chosen because I wanted to find the extraordinary within the mundane, to show how universal experiences of loneliness could be both specific and timeless. The woman's expression, which Victoria called melodramatic, had been painted and repainted dozens of times until I captured exactly the right balance between resignation and hope that I'd observed in my model's face. The lighting that she dismissed as amateurish chiaroscuro had been studied from master paintings in museums, adapted to serve the emotional needs of my composition, rather than simply copied. But Victoria's confidence was so absolute, her expertise so seemingly comprehensive, that even I began to question my own artistic choices. Maybe I really didn't understand what I was trying to accomplish. Maybe 5 years of work had been a waste of time and materials. I excused myself to the bathroom, needing a moment away from Victoria's continuing critique and the growing crowd of people who seemed to be accepting her assessment as gospel truth. Staring at myself in the mirror, I tried to reconcile the confident artist who'd created Waiting for the 6:15 with the person who'd just heard it dismissed as technically incompetent and emotionally shallow. Victoria's specific criticisms replayed in my mind, each one designed to demonstrate my fundamental misunderstanding of painting, composition, and artistic purpose. But as I thought about her comments more carefully, I began to notice inconsistencies and assumptions that seemed based more on preconceived notions than on careful observation. She'd criticized my brushwork without examining it closely, dismissed my color choices without considering their emotional function, and assumed derivative intent without understanding my actual influences and goals. Her review was comprehensive and confident, but was it actually accurate? Or was she, like many experts, so committed to her own framework that she couldn't see what was actually in front of her? When I returned to the gallery, Victoria was still holding court in front of my painting, now explaining to a larger audience why emerging artists needed more rigorous training before being given gallery representation. She'd expanded her critique into a broader commentary on the state of contemporary art education, using my work as evidence that art schools were failing to teach fundamental skills and critical thinking. According to Victoria, paintings like mine represented a troubling trend toward self-expression over technical mastery, resulting in work that might be personally meaningful to the artist, but failed to contribute anything significant to the cultural conversation. She suggested that galleries had a responsibility to maintain standards, to distinguish between art that deserved public attention and art that was merely therapeutic exercise disguised as professional practice. Several people in the audience were nodding along, clearly impressed by her breadth of knowledge and the authority with which she connected specific technical criticisms to broader cultural issues. Patricia appeared beside me again, this time with barely concealed panic in her expression. She whispered that Victoria had just announced her intention to write a full review for tomorrow's paper, and that her preliminary comments suggested it would be devastating for both my career and the gallery's reputation. Patricia had built Meridian Gallery's credibility by showing carefully curated emerging artists, and a scathing review from Victoria Whitfield could undermine years of relationship building with collectors and other critics. She asked again if she should intervene, perhaps by introducing me to Victoria as the artist, thinking that a personal connection might soften the critic's assessment, or at least provide an opportunity for dialogue. But I found myself curious about how far Victoria would take her critique, how completely she would demolish work she didn't realize belonged to someone standing nearby. I told Patricia to let it continue, that I wanted to hear Victoria's complete assessment before deciding how to respond. The gallery owner looked at me like I was choosing professional suicide, but she nodded and stepped back, trusting my judgment even as she clearly thought I was making a terrible mistake. Victoria's assistant asked whether she thought the artist showed any promise, whether there were elements of the work that might be developed with proper guidance and training. Victoria considered the question seriously, studying my painting with the intense focus of someone genuinely trying to find redeeming qualities despite her overall negative assessment. After a long moment, she conceded that the artist demonstrated basic technical competence in handling paint and canvas, suggesting that they weren't completely hopeless if they were willing to start over with proper instruction. She noted that the composition, while flawed, showed some understanding of visual balance, and that the color palette, while poorly executed, indicated an awareness of emotional temperature in painting. However, she emphasized that these minimal strengths were far outweighed by fundamental conceptual problems that suggested the artist didn't understand the difference between illustration and fine art. According to Victoria, the painting read more like a magazine illustration or book cover than a serious work meant for gallery exhibition, lacking the conceptual depth and technical sophistication that distinguished professional art from amateur expression. The crowd around Victoria had grown to include about 15 people, turning my opening reception into an impromptu masterclass in art criticism. I noticed several people discreetly photographing my painting while Victoria spoke, presumably to study it later in light of her detailed analysis. Some audience members asked follow-up questions about specific technical elements, and Victoria responded with the fluency of someone who'd spent decades studying and writing about art. She discussed everything from the history of urban realism to the proper use of atmospheric perspective, using my painting as a case study in how technical knowledge should serve conceptual goals rather than existing for its own sake. Her expertise was impressive, her knowledge comprehensive, and her confidence absolute. She spoke like someone who'd never been wrong about art, who could assess a painting's worth with the same certainty that a scientist might measure temperature or weight. The problem was that every specific criticism she made was based on misreading my actual artistic choices, interpreting deliberate decisions as accidental failures. A woman in the audience asked Victoria about the current state of art criticism, wondering whether critics had a responsibility to encourage emerging artists even when their work was flawed. Victoria's response revealed her philosophy about the critic's role in the art world, and it made my chest tighten with recognition of how completely she misunderstood her own position. She explained that critics served as gatekeepers for cultural standards, that their job was to distinguish between work that merited serious attention and work that was merely personal expression masquerading as professional art. According to Victoria, encouraging mediocre work out of kindness did a disservice to both artists and audiences, preventing real talent from receiving the recognition it deserved while cluttering galleries with inferior work. She claimed that honest criticism, even when harsh, was more valuable than false encouragement, because it helped artists understand the gap between their ambitions and their current abilities. The irony was that Victoria's honest criticism was based on fundamental misreadings of my intentions and techniques, making her harsh assessment not only wrong but potentially damaging to an artist whose work she simply didn't understand. I made my decision in that moment, walking directly toward Victoria and her audience while she continued explaining why contemporary art criticism needed to maintain rigorous standards. The conversations around me seemed to fade as I approached, my heart pounding but my resolve strengthening with each step. When I reached the edge of the crowd, I cleared my throat and said in a voice that carried across the gallery, "Excuse me, Ms. Whitfield. I couldn't help but overhear your analysis of this painting." Victoria turned toward me with the polite but slightly annoyed expression of someone whose expert commentary had been interrupted by a presumptuous gallery visitor. She clearly expected me to ask a question or make a comment that would allow her to further demonstrate her expertise, but something in my expression must have suggested a different kind of interaction was about to unfold. The crowd around us sensed a shift in energy, conversations stopping as people turned to see what was happening. Patricia, who'd been watching from across the room, started moving toward us with an expression of alarm mixed with fascination. Victoria smiled at me with the practiced patience of someone accustomed to dealing with enthusiastic but uninformed art lovers at gallery openings. She asked if I had a question about her analysis, her tone suggesting she'd be happy to educate me further about the painting's obvious flaws and the broader issues it represented in contemporary art. I looked directly at her, then at the painting, then back at her face as I said, "I'm wondering if you might reconsider your assessment if you knew the artist's actual intentions and working methods." Victoria's expression shifted slightly, her professional smile becoming more fixed as she sensed a challenge to her authority. She replied that the artist's intentions were irrelevant to the work's success or failure, that good art should communicate effectively regardless of what the creator meant to accomplish. According to Victoria, focusing on artistic intention was a sign of critical weakness, an unwillingness to engage with the work on its own terms. She asked if I was perhaps a friend of the artist, suggesting that personal relationships often clouded people's judgment about artistic quality. The moment had arrived, and I felt surprisingly calm as I responded to Victoria's question about my relationship to the artist. Actually, Ms. Whitfield, I am the artist. I painted, waiting for the 6:15, and I've been standing here for the past 20 minutes listening to you completely misinterpret my work. The words came out steadily, without anger or defensiveness, just a simple statement of fact that transformed the entire dynamic of the conversation. Victoria's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, embarrassment, and then something that looked almost like panic as she processed what I'd just revealed. The crowd around us had grown completely silent, everyone understanding that they were witnessing the kind of awkward encounter that would be discussed at art world parties for years to come. Victoria's assistant looked mortified, his pen frozen over his notebook as he realized he'd been documenting a critical disaster rather than an expert analysis. Patricia had reached us by now, her expression cycling between horror and fascination, as she watched one of the city's most influential critics confront the artist she'd just spent 20 minutes demolishing in public. Victoria's recovery was swift but transparent, her professional composure reasserting itself even as I could see the calculations happening behind her eyes. She immediately began backpedaling, explaining that she always preferred to encounter work without biographical context, that her criticism was purely aesthetic and not intended as a personal attack on the artist. She suggested that her analysis could still be valuable as a demonstration of how work might be perceived by viewers who approached it without knowledge of the creator's background or intentions. According to Victoria, the disconnect between her reading and my intentions might actually reveal important information about how effectively the painting communicated its themes to uninformed audiences. She was essentially trying to reframe her comprehensive dismissal of my work as a constructive exercise in critical methodology, but everyone present could hear the desperation in her voice as she attempted to maintain her authority in an increasingly untenable situation. The confidence that had characterized her earlier critique had evaporated, replaced by the careful language of someone trying to minimize professional damage. I found myself oddly calm as I responded to Victoria's attempted recovery, perhaps because her misreadings had been so comprehensive that they'd moved beyond hurtful into the realm of simply incorrect. I explained that I'd been curious to hear an expert's unfiltered response to my work, that I'd learned valuable information about how critics approached contemporary painting, but that virtually every specific criticism she'd made was based on misunderstanding my actual techniques and intentions. I walked closer to the painting and began pointing out details she'd missed or misinterpreted. The careful gradation of light that created psychological rather than literal atmosphere, the deliberate choice of subway setting as contemporary equivalent to traditional genre scenes, the specific brushwork that built emotional texture rather than photographic detail. With each correction, Victoria's earlier certainty looked more and more like the kind of confident ignorance that occurs when expertise becomes dogma. Several people in the crowd were now looking back and forth between Victoria and me, clearly reassessing their earlier acceptance of her authority as they watched her scramble to maintain credibility. Victoria's assistant had stopped taking notes and was now staring at his mentor with an expression that suggested his faith in her expertise was undergoing real-time revision. The crowd that had gathered to hear her expert analysis was experiencing a masterclass in how critical authority could be constructed through confidence rather than accuracy. Some people began drifting away, clearly uncomfortable with witnessing Victoria's professional humiliation, but others seemed fascinated by the reversal of power dynamics, by seeing an established critic's assessment challenged by the artist whose work she'd dismissed. Patricia was hovering nearby, still unsure whether this confrontation would ultimately help or hurt the gallery's reputation, but clearly unable to look away from the dramatic scene unfolding in front of my centerpiece painting. The gallery opening had transformed from a polite social gathering into something much more unpredictable, the kind of event that people would remember and discuss long after the exhibition ended. Victoria made one final attempt to salvage her position, suggesting that the disconnect between her reading and my intentions might actually strengthen the work by creating multiple layers of meaning that viewers could discover through careful analysis. She claimed that the best art often succeeded in ways that even the artist didn't fully understand, that critical interpretation could reveal depths and complexities that existed beyond the creator's conscious awareness. According to Victoria, her initial reading might have been incomplete, but it wasn't necessarily wrong, because meaning in art emerged from the interaction between work and viewer rather than being entirely determined by artistic intent. It was a sophisticated argument that might have worked in an academic setting, but in the context of her having just spent 20 minutes systematically demolishing my technical skills and conceptual understanding, it sounded more like face-saving rationalization than genuine critical insight. The crowd could sense her desperation, and several people exchanged glances that suggested they weren't buying her attempt to reframe comprehensive error as interpretive complexity. The aftermath of the confrontation unfolded over the following weeks as news of Victoria's public error spread through the local art world. Several people who'd witnessed the exchange posted about it on social media, and the story grew with each retelling until it became a cautionary tale about the dangers of overconfident criticism. Victoria's review of my exhibition, when it appeared in the paper 3 days later, was notably restrained and focused more on general observations about emerging artists than on specific critiques of individual paintings. She made no mention of our gallery confrontation, but her assessment of waiting for the 6:15 was markedly different from the dismissive commentary I'd heard in person. The review described the painting as an ambitious attempt to address urban isolation through traditional painterly means, acknowledging technical competence while questioning whether the approach was sufficiently innovative for contemporary discourse. It was the kind of measured, non-committal review that critics write when they want to avoid controversy, and it bore no resemblance to the confident demolition job she'd delivered to her impromptu audience. Patricia called me a few days after the review appeared, laughing as she reported that several collectors who'd witnessed the gallery confrontation had contacted her about purchasing pieces from the exhibition. According to Patricia, the story had become a talking point in art world circles, with Victoria's error serving as evidence that even established critics could miss important qualities in contemporary work. The incident had generated more attention for my exhibition than any positive review might have achieved, turning my opening from a quiet debut into a memorable event that people were discussing weeks later. Patricia suggested that I'd handled the situation perfectly, neither attacking Victoria personally nor backing down from defending my work, demonstrating the kind of professional grace that impressed both critics and collectors. She'd already received inquiries from 2 other galleries about future exhibitions, and she attributed the interest directly to how I'd managed the challenging situation with Victoria. Sometimes, Patricia observed, being wronged publicly by the right person could launch a career more effectively than being praised by everyone. 3 months later, I received an unexpected email from Victoria's former assistant, who'd left his internship and was now working as a freelance art writer. He wanted to interview me about the experience of being publicly critiqued by someone who completely misunderstood my work, and about how artists might navigate similar situations in the future. During our conversation, he revealed that the gallery incident had prompted him to question Victoria's methods and the broader culture of authoritative criticism in the art world. He'd realized that Victoria's confidence had impressed him more than her accuracy, and that he'd been accepting her assessments without developing his own analytical skills. The experience had taught him to look more carefully at artwork before accepting any critic's interpretation, whether positive or negative, and to remember that expertise could sometimes become a barrier to genuine perception rather than a tool for deeper understanding. He was writing an article about the incident for an online art magazine, exploring how critics need to appear authoritative might sometimes prevent them from engaging honestly with unfamiliar work. A year after the exhibition, Waiting for the 6:15 was acquired by the city's Contemporary Art Museum for their permanent collection. The curator who made the acquisition mentioned that she'd heard about Victoria's initial dismissal of the piece, and that the contrast between the critics' assessment and the painting's subsequent recognition had influenced her decision to look more carefully at emerging artists whose work might be overlooked by established gatekeepers. The museum's press release about the acquisition noted the painting's sophisticated exploration of urban psychological states through carefully controlled painterly techniques, language that directly contradicted every criticism Victoria had made during her gallery commentary. The acquisition validated not just my individual work, but also Patricia's eye for recognizing quality that more established figures had missed. It demonstrated that critical authority could be wrong, that confident dismissal wasn't the same as accurate assessment, and that artists needed to trust their own vision even when experts questioned their judgment. Appreciate you watching this far. If you enjoyed it, drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story.